A bus filled with NYSC Corps members traveling from their PPA had a terrible accident. Only 2 out of over 14 passengers survived. Their journey had started with laughter and excitement, young souls filled with dreams of a bright future. But none of them knew that fate had other plans. Join us as one of the survivors tell the story of how greed leads to destruction, not just for ourselves, but for those around us. One choice, one mistake, can change everything. Watch till the end to discover the price of betrayal.
In a small, quiet village surrounded by tall trees and wide rivers, a group of young NYSC corpers arrived for their one-year youth service to the community. They were full of excitement and energy, ready to teach, help, and make new friends. Among them was a boy named James, always laughing, always curious, and always looking for adventure. James and his friends, Grace, Ahmed, and Kelechi, quickly became part of the village. The elders welcomed them warmly, and the children followed them everywhere, eager to learn. But something in the village always made James wonder. The king's palace. The palace was big, with golden gates that shone under the sun. Tall statues stood like guards, watching everyone who passed. But inside, there was something even more special. A golden crown. The villagers said it was no ordinary crown. It belonged to the great spirits of the land and had been in the palace for centuries. No one was allowed to touch it. No one dared to even go too close. One evening, as the sun turned the sky orange, James and his friends took a walk near the palace. That was when they saw it, the golden crown, sitting on a high stand, glowing like fire. "It's real gold," James whispered, his eyes wide. "We shouldn't be here," Grace said, pulling his arm. "The villagers say the crown is protected by spirits." "Those are just stories," James laughed. "The villagers are just naive and don't know the worth and value of this crown. Think about it, if we take it to the city, we can sell it and be rich." Ahmed and Kelechi looked at each other. The thought of being rich made their hearts race. But Grace shook her head. "No. It's dangerous." James smirked. "You can stay scared, Grace. But I know what I want." As the days passed and their National Youth Service program in the village came to an end, James couldn't stop thinking about the crown. On their last night in the village, when everyone was asleep, he made his move. With Ahmed and Kelechi by his side, he sneaked into the palace. The hall was dark and quiet, but the golden crown shone like the moon. His heart pounded. Slowly, he reached out, lifted it, and tucked it into his bag. As they rushed back to their rooms, Grace saw them. Her eyes widened in horror. "Tell me you didn't take it." But James grinned. "We're rich now, Grace. That's all that matters." She took a step back, fear in her eyes. "You don't know what you've done. You've brought trouble to all of us." James shrugged. "Trouble? The only trouble is that you didn't take it with us." The next morning, they packed their bags and boarded a bus, ready to leave the village forever. But as the bus rumbled down the road, something felt wrong. The air turned heavy, and the once bright sky darkened. Grace closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. James only laughed. "Prayers won't change the fact that we won." But he didn't know, the spirits had already begun to follow them. And they were not happy. The bus rumbled along the dusty road, leaving the village behind. James leaned back in his seat, feeling the weight of the golden crown in his bag. He grinned, imagining the riches that awaited them. Ahmed and Kelechi exchanged nervous glances, but they said nothing. All they were just interested in is selling the gold crown, make money, and enjoy themselves. None of them ever thought about the magnitude of the crime and sacrilege they had committed. Grace, however, sat stiffly in her seat, her hands clenched together. She could feel it, The air had changed. The wind whispered through the open window, carrying a voice too soft to understand, but cold enough to send shivers down her spine. "James," she said in a low voice, "something is wrong." James rolled his eyes. "Grace, stop being scared. We're fine." Suddenly a loud bang echoed through the bus, making everyone jump. The driver cursed under his breath and pulled the bus to the side of the road. "Flat tire," he muttered. Ahmed sighed. "Great. Just what we need." The passengers stepped out, stretching their legs. The sun was setting, painting the sky in deep shades of red and purple. The trees around them rustled even though there was no wind. Kelechi nudged James. "Did you hear that?" A low whisper, like a breath in the ear. James turned around sharply. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. The driver pulled out a spare tire and started working. But as he did, the whispers grew louder. Grace felt her chest tighten. Then she remembered the earlier warnings of the villagers, that taking the crown was dangerous. Just as she was thinking about the warning, suddenly, from the corner of the road, a dark figure appeared. It had no face, only hollow eyes that burned like dying embers. It stood still for a moment, watching them. Then, it took a step forward. Grace gasped. "James." James followed her gaze and felt his blood turn cold. The figure was moving toward them, slow but steady. The air around it shimmered like heat waves, twisting and bending. Ahmed stumbled backward. What is that?" James gripped his bag. "It's nothing. Just a trick of the light." But deep down, he knew he was wrong. He was trying to twist the fact that they are being hunted by spirits because of the crown he stole. The figure stopped just a few feet away. Then, in a voice that was not human, it spoke. "Return what you have stolen." The words slithered through the air, curling around them like smoke. The driver and the other passengers didn't seem to notice. It was speaking only to them. Kelechi's voice trembled. "James, we need to return the crown." James's fingers tightened around the bag. "No. We've come too far." The figure tilted its head. The hollow eyes darkened. Then, the bus lights flickered. The air grew thick. A deep growl rumbled through the trees. Grace grabbed James's arm. "Please," she whispered. "Before it's too late." But before James could answer, the lights went out completely. While this whole thing was going on, the driver concentrated on changing the tire of the bus. As he finished changing the tire, he hopped in and restarted the bus, forcing the engine to roar to life. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, sending the vehicle speeding down the road, away from the trees, away from the whispers. The bus sped down the dusty road, bouncing over bumps and potholes. The sky remained dark, thick clouds swirling like an angry storm waiting to break. Grace sat stiffly in her seat, her arms wrapped around herself. She kept glancing at James's bag, as if expecting something to crawl out of it. Ahmed and Kelechi whispered excitedly about all the things they would buy once they sold the crown. But Grace wasn't listening. Then, the bus hit another deep pothole, and the passengers let out small gasps. The driver cursed under his breath and tightened his grip on the wheel. And that's when it happened. The air inside the bus suddenly turned freezing cold. Not just a little cool, cold enough to see their breath in the air. Ahmed shivered. "What's going on? Why is it so cold?" Grace's voice was barely above a whisper. "It's starting." Before James could ask what she meant, a deep groaning sound filled the bus. The windows rattled, the floor trembled, and then, bang! The back door of the bus swung open by itself. The passengers screamed. "Stop the bus!" someone shouted. The driver tried, but the brakes refused to work. The bus kept going, the engine roaring louder and louder. The groaning sound they heard before returned, but this time, it wasn't coming from the bus. It was coming from behind them. James turned his head slowly. Through the open back door, he saw something standing in the middle of the road. A shadowy figure. Tall. Thin. Unmoving. It had no face, but somehow, James knew it was looking straight at him. His heart pounded. The figure lifted one long, bony arm and pointed directly at him. The whispers returned. But now, they weren't soft. They were loud, hissing voices that filled his ears, speaking words he couldn't understand. Grace grabbed his hand, her nails digging into his skin. "Give it back, James. Right now." James's hands trembled. We can't just throw it away." Before he could finish, the bus shook violently. The lights flickered. The other passengers were screaming, some covering their heads, others holding onto their seats. The driver slammed his foot on the brakes again, and this time, the bus jerked to a stop. The passengers sat frozen in fear, eyes wide, breath shaky. Ahmed turned to James. I think Grace is right, man." Kelechi swallowed hard. "That thing, it was looking at you." Grace exhaled slowly. "This is only the first warning, James. If you don't return the crown, the next one will be worse." James gripped his bag, his fingers digging into the fabric. But out of greed he still wasn't ready to let go. The bus rolled to a stop in the middle of a lonely road. The driver, breathing heavily, and wiping sweat from his forehead. The driver, being confused, brought out his mechanical tools to check what was wrong with the bus, but after checking, "Engine's fine," he muttered, twisting the keys. But the bus refused to start again. Outside, the road ahead seemed to fade into thick fog. The trees that lined the path looked taller, darker, like silent giants watching them. The passengers whispered among themselves, clutching their bags. Something was wrong. James held onto his bag tightly, his heartbeat drumming in his ears. Grace's voice was sharp. "James, we need to go back." Ahmed scoffed, trying to shake off the fear. "Go back? We're almost free." Grace pointed at the road. "Look. Does that look normal to you?" The road, which had been clear a moment ago, was now swallowed by an endless mist. The driver stepped out, looking around nervously. The moment his foot touched the ground, a deep whisper filled the air. It wasn't coming from one place, it was everywhere. Ahmed gripped James's arm. "Did you hear that?" Before James could answer, the fog shifted. A shadow moved inside it. Something was there. Watching. Waiting. The driver hopped back into the bus, his face pale. "Everybody, stay inside," he instructed all passengers. "I think something is wrong, but I can't really tell what it is." The footsteps grew louder. Closer. Grace grabbed James's wrist. "James, I swear, if you don't get rid of that crown." She couldn't finish her statement when they heard a loud sound. The windows shook. Passengers screamed. The bus lights flickered wildly. The driver scrambled inside, slamming the door shut. "I don't know what's happening," he panted. "But we're not safe here." He twisted the key again. This time, the bus started. The fog swirled angrily around them as if it didn't want them to leave. But the driver tried all he could to start the bus and moved it away from the angry-looking fog. As they sped forward, James dared to look back. The shadow in the fog lifted its arm, pointing straight at him. His stomach twisted. The whispering voices returned. But now, he could hear the words. "Return what was stolen, or be lost forever." The bus burst out of the fog like a bullet. The sky brightened. The road was clear again. Everyone let out a breath of relief. But James knew they are being hunted because of what he stole. As the bus continued to speed down the dusty road, leaving the eerie fog behind, everyone inside tried to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over them. The driver gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Grace sat stiffly in her seat, her fingers curled into fists. She had warned them. She had begged them. But James hadn't listened. And now, things have gone really bad for all of them. The sin of one is now hunting everybody. James leaned back, pretending to be relaxed. See? Nothing happened, he said with a grin. Ahmed chuckled nervously. Yeah, maybe it was just fog. Weird, creepy fog. Grace didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the aisle of the bus. Something felt off. The air was colder now. The bus was moving, but it felt too quiet. Then, she saw a shadow. Sitting in front of her. Her breath hitched. That seat had been empty when they got on. She nudged James. Look, she whispered. James turned and frowned. There was someone sitting there. A figure wrapped in a dark cloak, head bowed, face hidden. Ahmed swallowed hard. Who is that? I don't know, Grace whispered. But I swear, that seat was empty before. Kelechi shifted uncomfortably. Maybe they got on when we stopped. But the door never opened, Grace said. The driver glanced at the mirror, his face suddenly pale. His hands trembled as he turned his eyes back to the road. James licked his lips. It's probably just a villager catching a ride. Then why won't they move? Ahmed whispered. The figure remained completely still. No shifting, no breathing sounds. Just sitting. Grace's stomach twisted. She could feel it. The presence. Heavy. Watching. She couldn't take it anymore. Slowly, she stood up. Step by step, she walked down the aisle, her heart thudding against her ribs. She stopped 2 seats away. Excuse me? Her voice was barely above a whisper. No answer. She stepped closer. Sir? The figure's head snapped up. A cold wind blasted through the bus. Grace stumbled back, her scream stuck in her throat. The figure had no face. Just darkness where a face should be. The bus jerked violently. The lights flickered. The driver slammed on the brakes, sending everyone flying forward. The shadowy figure slowly stood up. And then, it vanished. They were all scared but were determined to leave this bushy village road and reach Lagos before night. The driver, out of fear, stepped on the accelerator with fear all over him. The bus sped down the lonely road, the fog growing thicker around it. The whispers had stopped, but the eerie silence that followed was even worse. As they continued their journey, suddenly a long bang was heard. Something mysterious and invisible had hit the bus from behind, making it swerve violently. The driver struggled to regain control, but it was no use. The road twisted before them, and the bus hurtled straight toward a massive oak tree. And it was an accident. Screams filled the air for a moment, then silence followed. James groaned, his body aching as he forced his eyes open. The bus was in ruins. The windows were shattered, the seats torn apart. Smoke curled into the sky. The bodies of his friends lay lifeless around him. Ahmed, Kelechi, the driver, and other corpers in the bus all lost their lives in the accident. His heart pounded as he crawled out, gasping for breath. He turned and saw Grace lying nearby, covered in cuts and bruises but breathing. She stared, opening her eyes. James, she whispered. James's hands shook. Grace, everyone else, they're gone. Tears welled in her eyes, but then she whispered, I prayed. Before we left, I prayed. That's the only reason I survived. A cold wind blew through the wreckage. Then, a voice, deep and hollow, filled the air. You were warned, thief. James gasped, spinning around. Shadows moved within the mist, forming dark figures. He clutched his bag, where the golden crown still lay hidden. His hands trembled. Grace looked at him, her face filled with fear and sorrow. James, it's the crown. You must return it. We have suffered enough. Don't let greed manipulate you. The voice spoke again. Return what you have stolen, or you will never escape. James dropped to his knees. He had wanted adventure. He had wanted riches. But now, he had nothing. Nothing, except a cursed treasure that had taken away the lives of his friends. James sat beside the wreckage, his body shaking. The weight of what had happened pressed down on him. His best friends, gone. His dreams of riches turned to dust. Because of his greed. He clutched his head, his heart pounding. Why did I do this? He whispered. Why didn't I listen? The wailing of sirens broke the silence. An ambulance arrived, and men rushed toward them. Grace was carefully lifted onto a stretcher and carried to the hospital. James watched as the lifeless bodies of Ahmed, Kelechi, and the driver were taken to the morgue. The sight made his chest tighten. Tears filled his eyes. I am the cause of their death, he muttered. My greed for money has cost them their lives. He looked down at his bag. The golden crown still gleamed, untouched by the chaos around him. The spirit's warning echoed in his mind. Return what you have stolen, or you will never escape. With shaking hands, he made a decision. I have to take it back, he whispered. I have to return it. It was the only way to make things right. The only way to silence the spirits. The only way to save himself. James wasted no time. He traveled back to the village, carrying the cursed crown. When he reached the palace, he fell to his knees before the king, his voice shaking. Please. I beg for mercy. I have returned what I stole. The villagers gathered, their faces filled with disappointment. We trusted you, one elder said. You were supposed to teach us, yet you let greed consume you. The king sighed. You are forgiven, but the spirits do not forget so easily. There is always a price to pay when you go against them. Go and sin no more, the king said to him. Just as James turned to leave, his phone rang. It was his younger brother. His voice was filled with sorrow. James, Mama is gone. She fell sick yesterday and she didn't make it. James's knees gave way. His heart shattered. His greed had not only taken his friends, but now his own mother. Is this what the king meant by there is a price to pay? How could I have allowed greed ruin my life and that of my loved ones? He cried and wailed for hours, but no one came close to console him. James sat in the village square long after the sun had set, staring blankly at the ground. He had lost everything. His friends, his mother, and even his own peace of mind. The weight of guilt pressed on his chest like a boulder, suffocating him. The golden crown was gone, but its curse still clung to his soul. The villagers slowly left the palace, murmuring among themselves. No one could look at him the same way anymore. He had come to the village as a mentor, a role model. But now, he was nothing more than a thief who had betrayed their trust. The spirits had taken their price, and he had paid in blood and sorrow. Few days later James visited Grace in the hospital where she was admitted. She was still weak from the accident, and not fully recovered. James begged for forgiveness and wept bitterly. Grace consoled him and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. James, you need to leave this place. Go back home. But more than that, you need to change. He looked at her, his eyes hollow. How do I live with myself, Grace? My greed cost their death. My own mother too, died because of it. She knelt beside him, her voice steady but filled with kindness. No, James. The spirits took them, but you still have a chance to make things right. Not for them, but for yourself. You can't bring them back, but you can change. You can choose to live differently. Those words echoed in his mind. Long after returning to the city, he found his home filled with grief. His younger brother looked at him with tear-streaked eyes. unable to understand how their strong, healthy mother had died overnight. James stood in front of her framed photo, his heart breaking into a million pieces. That night, he wept like he had never wept before. He begged for forgiveness, not just from his mother, but from the heavens above. He prayed for the souls of his lost friends, for grace, and for himself. The next morning, he made a decision that would change his life forever. James abandoned his old ways. He left behind his pursuit of wealth and selfish desires. Instead, he turned to the one thing that had saved Grace from death: faith. He immersed himself in the teachings of repentance, of grace, of second chances. Slowly, he rebuilt his life, not with riches, but with purpose. Years later, he stood in front of a congregation, dressed in white robes. The man who had once stolen a sacred crown now carried a different message. He spoke of redemption, of the dangers of greed, and of the mercy that even the most lost souls could find if they turned back before it was too late. People came from far and wide to hear him speak. His words were filled with the raw pain of his past, but also with the hope of his transformation. He became a pastor, not out of a desire for power, but out of a deep longing to prevent others from making the same mistakes he had made. And though the scars of his past would never fully heal, he had found peace. The spirits had taken much from him, but they had also given him something in return: wisdom, purpose, and a second chance at life.
The story teaches us that greed leads to destruction, and also the importance of making wise choices, being content, and always doing the right thing. James's selfish desire for wealth blinded him to the consequences of his actions. His decision to steal the golden crown not only cost him his friends but also led to the tragic loss of his mother. In the end, he learned that material riches gained dishonestly come with a heavy price. We truly appreciate you for taking the time to watch this beautiful story. We hope this story touched your heart and taught valuable lessons about greed, choices, and redemption. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more thrilling and inspiring content, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to bring you more exciting stories. Let us know in the comments what lesson you learned from this story. Stay tuned, stay inspired, and keep watching.